Over the last several weeks, we have talked about civics and government. We have talked about not only the different types of government, but what what happens once you become a citizen of a government. What types of rights and privileges are granted to you once you become a member of that government or are ruled by that government, depending on that government's type. And depending on the type of government that you live under or ruled by, depends on the type of privileges and rights that are granted to you. And if you are not liking the type of rights and privileges that are granted to you, you have the option of doing something about it. And what you do about it is what you have to do and check yourself for. In other words, what are you willing to do and how far are you willing to go to fight for what you believe in and what rights and privileges you feel you should be granted for or granted to? How far are you willing to go and what are you willing to fight for the for the rights and privileges in order to live, in order to have the kind of life that you feel you should be living on a day to day basis. In other words, what rights would you die for if it came down to it? Throughout history, people have rose up and protested to varying degrees, both peacefully and with their lives for rights and privileges that they felt they deserved in order to live their lives to the fullest extent. So, as we go through this presentation, I want you to gut check yourself. What rights would you die for? Tank Man, Tiananmen Square, Beijing, China, 1989. In June of 1989, pro democracy protests broke out in the city of Beijing, China, a very communist country. These protests came on the heels of a wave of other pro democracy sentiments that had been taking place all over the world, including the collapse of the Berlin Wall in Germany. Many of the demonstrators were high school and college students, and the protests were concentrated in the Beijing's historic Tiananmen Square in the heart of the city. Chinese officials were anxious to put an end to the demonstrations and ordered police and soldiers to shoot and kill the student protesters on the second day of the uprising. One protester stood out. As documented by film taken at the time, Tank Man, wearing a simple white shirt, dark pants, and carrying two shopping bags, initially halted the tanks by displaying the palm of his right hand in what is universally recognized as the signal for stop. The tanks did indeed stop, and Tank Man was seen climbing up the front of the lead tank and standing on it for several moments, during which time he spoke with a crew member. Though the tanks attempted to maneuver around Tank Man, he repeatedly moved to block their path. Soon, two men, possibly government officials, forcibly removed Tank Man from his position and carried him off, after which the tanks proceeded on their way. Which rights would you die for? The 3rd of May, 1808. Painting by Francisco Goya, artist. Spanish resistance to Napoleon in Peninsular War. In 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte, or Napoleon I, King of France, seemed bent on conquering the world. brought Spain's king Charles IV into alliance with him in order to conquer Portugal. Napoleon's troops poured into Spain, supposedly just passing through. But Napoleon's real intentions soon became clear. The alliance was a trick. The French were taking over. Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother, was to be made the new King of Spain. On May 2nd, 1808, hundreds of Spaniards rebelled against the French occupation. On May 3rd, these Spanish freedom fighters were rounded up and massacred by the French occupationists. Their blood literally ran through the streets of Madrid. This was to be the start of a 5-year war to rid Spain of French occupancy. Again, what rights would you die for? Selma March. Dr. Martin Luther King leading march from Selma to Montgomery to protest lack of voting rights for African Americans. Beside King is John Lewis, Reverend Jesse Douglas, James Forman, and Ralph Abernathy. March 1965. Even after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 forbade discrimination in voting on the basis of race, efforts by civil rights organizations to register Black voters met with fierce resistance in southern states such as Alabama. These groups and others um, staged protests to bring attention to the voting rights inequities that Black Americans faced in Alabama. On February 18th, white segregationists attacked a group of peaceful demonstrators in the town of Marion, Alabama. In the ensuing chaos, an Alabama state trooper fatally shot Jimmy Lee Jackson, a young African American demonstrator. In response to Jackson's death, a massive protest march was planned from from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery, 54 miles away. A group of 600 people set out from Selma on Sunday, March 7, 1965, a day that would come to be known as Bloody Sunday. The marchers didn't get far before Alabama state troopers, wielding whips, nightsticks, and tear gas, rushed the group at the Edmund Pettus Bridge and beat them back to Selma. The brutal scene was captured on television, enraging many Americans and drawing civil rights and religious leaders of all faiths to Selma in protest. On March 9th, Dr. Martin Luther King led more than 2,000 marchers, black and white, across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but found Highway 80 blocked again by state troopers. King paused the marchers and led them in prayer, whereupon the troopers stepped aside. What rights would you die for? Mahatma Gandhi, the Salt March, challenge to British occupation of India, March 12, 1930. The Salt March, which took place from March to April 1930 in India, was an act of civil disobedience led by Mohandas Gandhi to protest British rule in India. During the march, thousands of Indians followed Gandhi from his religious retreat near Ahmedabad to the Arabian Sea coast, a distance of some 240 miles. The march resulted in the arrest of nearly 60,000 people, including Gandhi himself. India was finally granted its independence in 1947. What rights would you die for? The American Revolution, the Battle of Springfield, artist unknown, June 23rd, 1780. The American Revolution was known as the with the battles of Lexington and Concord was known as the shot heard around the world. This little ragtag bag of 13 colonies took on the most powerful nation on the earth at the time, Great Britain, and won its independence against the most powerful navy and army the world had ever seen. By fighting for its independence against what it felt was unfair taxes and oppression, it sparked a wave of other countries fighting for their own independence against what it felt were against oppression from their monarchies, including Great Britain itself. Again, what rights would you die for? Malala Yousafzai, 17-year-old Pakistani education advocate, 2012. As a young girl, Malala Yousafzai defied the Taliban in Pakistan and demanded that girls be allowed to receive an education. She was shot in the head by a Taliban gunman in 2012, but survived and has continued to speak out on the importance of education. In 2014, she became the youngest person to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. What rights would you die for? What rights do you consider the government granting you as essential for you to live your daily life? Are you willing to fight for those rights to the point of giving up your life? Would it have to come to that point? And if it did, would you be willing to step up? That's the gut check that you need to make. Throughout history, people have had to step up. Some did, some did not. Hopefully, you would never have to be put in that position. But if you were, would you be willing to do that? And would you know what you stand for? Now is the time to start thinking about what you stand for and determining what is important to you. So, again, ask yourself, what rights would you die for?